The unexpected stop. Captain Elijah Daniels had been at sea for months. The endless days of training exercises, tactical drills, and the stark isolation of life on a Navy ship had taken its toll on him. But tonight was different. Tonight, after what felt like an eternity, he was finally heading home. As the Navy captain navigated the familiar roads back to his family, the weight of his uniform and the title he held seemed to lighten. He couldn't wait to surprise his wife, Maya, and their 2 children, who had only seen him through video calls during his deployment. He was exhausted, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that the long journey was almost over. The dark night sky above him, the faint glow of the dashboard lights, and the rhythmic hum of the car were all a soundtrack to his relief. But then, without warning, a harsh flash of red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. His heart immediately skipped a beat. Confused, Elijah glanced nervously over his shoulder. There was no reason for him to be stopped. He hadn't broken any traffic laws, and yet here he was, forced to pull over to the side of the road. The rapid beat of his heart echoed in his ears as he slowly came to a stop, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The voice of a young female officer cut through the silence, firm and commanding. "Driver, step out of the vehicle," she called. Elijah's mind raced. Why was he being stopped? Was there something wrong with his car? He hadn't expected to be accosted by anyone, let alone a police officer, after all his years of service. Trying to stay calm, he turned off the engine and opened the door. The officer's eyes were intense as she approached, her flashlight cutting through the dark. Her hand rested near her holster, fingers hovering as though ready to draw at a moment's notice. He stood at attention, instinctively straightening his posture. "I've been deployed for months," Elijah began, his voice steady despite the nervousness creeping up inside. "I'm Captain Elijah Daniels of the United States Navy. Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't immediately respond. Instead, she scanned him carefully, eyes narrowing in suspicion. The seconds felt like hours as she finally spoke. "We received a report of a theft nearby. The suspect fits your description. A black male in his 40s driving a dark sedan." Elijah's heart sank, his mind struggling to process the words. "Fitting your description." The accusation cut deep. He hadn't done anything wrong, but suddenly, he was seen as a potential criminal simply because of the color of his skin and the car he was driving. Elijah took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Ma'am, I've been traveling all day," he continued, voice calm yet tinged with disbelief. "I'm just trying to get home to my family. I've got my ID right here. Please, you can check it." But the officer's face remained hard, her expression unmoving. She motioned for him to step away from the vehicle. "Keep your hands where I can see them," she said coldly, her voice never wavering. Elijah complied, trying to keep the situation calm and avoid any escalation. But inside, a storm was brewing. How had things gotten so out of hand? He wasn't just a military officer. He wasn't just a father, a husband. He was a black man, and that fact was all that seemed to matter in this moment. And so there he stood, a Navy captain with years of distinguished service, being treated like a criminal on the side of the road. His heart ached, and he could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, watching from behind their windows. Were they wondering if he was guilty? Or were they silently hoping for him to clear this up? As he stood there, another patrol car arrived. This time, a male officer joined the scene, his eyes just as wary as the female officers. Elijah had seen this before. The arrival of more officers wasn't meant to de-escalate the situation. It only made things more tense. "Are you sure this is the guy?" the male officer asked, his voice low. The female officer, whose name tag read Officer Grant, nodded sharply. "He matches the description." Elijah took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even despite the frustration rising within him. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but please, if you check my ID, this can all be resolved quickly. I'm just trying to get home." But instead of responding to his plea, Officer Grant signaled for Elijah to remain in position. "Keep your hands on the hood," she instructed, her voice sharp. "You're being detained while we sort this out." Standing there, humiliated and helpless, Elijah could feel his patience thinning. His entire career, his entire identity, seemed to mean nothing in this moment. He wasn't Captain Daniels. He wasn't a decorated officer of the United States Navy. He was simply a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. As more tension built between them, a third officer arrived. A sergeant who immediately sensed the palpable tension in the air. She observed the scene and then turned her attention to Elijah. "What's going on here?" the sergeant asked, her voice far more measured than Officer Grant's. The rising tensions. As the sergeant stepped closer, her presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the encounter. Officer Grant had been rigid, suspicious, and unyielding, but the sergeant exuded an air of experience and authority that seemed to calm the tension in the air. Elijah could feel a slight release in the grip of his anxiety, though his heart still raced, a reminder of the shock and humiliation he had just endured. The sergeant's gaze softened as she looked at him, taking in his posture, still standing straight despite the degrading circumstances. She was no stranger to difficult situations, but there was something different about this one. As her eyes lingered on the ID partially visible in Elijah's pocket, the recognition in her eyes was unmistakable. "Captain Daniels." The sergeant's voice held a trace of respect as she asked his name, her tone much different from Officer Grant's suspicion-laden commands. Elijah exhaled slowly, his body finally allowing a moment of relief as he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Elijah Daniels, United States Navy. I've been deployed for months." The sergeant took a moment to assess the situation, her eyes now focused on Officer Grant, whose expression had faltered when Elijah's identity was revealed. There was a visible shift in the younger officer's demeanor, her shoulders sagging slightly as the reality of her mistake began to settle in. For a moment, everything was still. The noise of the nearby traffic, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant hum of the city all seemed muted in that brief pause. Elijah's mind raced, but he kept his composure. His heart still ached from the sting of injustice, but he remained silent, allowing the sergeant to take charge. Finally, she spoke again, this time her tone firm and disappointed. "Officer Grant, did you verify his identity before detaining him?" The question hung in the air, sharp and direct. There was no room for ambiguity in her voice. Grant hesitated, clearly taken aback by the sergeant's reprimand. The younger officer looked down at her shoes for a moment, as if gathering the courage to admit her error. But it was clear that there was no way to justify her actions. Elijah's military identification was right there, plainly visible in his pocket, and yet she had chosen to assume the worst based on little more than a vague description. The surgeon's disappointment was palpable, and she let out a sigh, her eyes narrowing in frustration. You can't just detain someone without verifying their identity, especially when the person you're accusing has served this country with distinction for over 20 years. This is not how we do things. Elijah remained silent, but inside, he could feel his chest tighten with a mix of emotions. Pride in his service, frustration at being treated as a criminal, and the sting of the injustice that seemed to haunt him, no matter how far he had come in life. The sergeant turned to the male officer who had joined the scene earlier, asking him to step aside. She took a deep breath, her posture softening slightly as she looked back at Elijah. "Captain Daniels, I apologize for the way you've been treated," she said, her voice carrying the weight of sincerity. "This shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure everything is taken care of." The apology, while appreciated, didn't seem to erase the damage that had already been done. Elijah had served his country with honor and pride, dedicating years of his life to ensuring the safety and security of his fellow Americans. Yet, in a moment, all of that seemed irrelevant. He had been reduced to nothing more than a suspect, his identity as a Navy captain dismissed in favor of the assumption that he was guilty of something. His eyes flickered to Officer Grant, whose stance was now slumped, clearly embarrassed by the sergeant's rebuke. Grant avoided his gaze, her lips pressed into a tight line, as if she were unsure of what to say. The look in her eyes was a mixture of regret and uncertainty, a stark contrast to the suspicion she had displayed earlier. There was no apology from her, no acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Her actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. Elijah felt a pang of bitterness at the silence. He had been humiliated, stripped of his dignity in front of his community, in front of neighbors who had seen the entire ordeal unfold. It didn't matter that he had served his country with distinction, or that his identity was clear and legitimate. To them, he was just another black man, and that was all they needed to see. It was a reality that many people of color faced on a daily basis, where their very presence could trigger suspicion, where their actions were viewed through the lens of prejudice, no matter their background or accomplishments. The sergeant, noticing the discomfort in the air, turned back to Officer Grant, her voice now softer but still carrying the weight of authority. "This kind of treatment cannot continue. We are here to serve and protect, but that doesn't mean we can let our biases cloud our judgment. Captain Daniels deserves respect, just like any other person on this road." There was a pause as Officer Grant nodded, though it was clear that the severity of the situation had hit her hard. Elijah wondered if she fully understood the gravity of her actions. Would she change? Would the humiliation she had caused him be enough to make her question her assumptions and biases in the future? He wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to hold his breath for an immediate change. The sergeant finally turned back to Elijah, her expression softening slightly. "Captain, I can only offer my apologies for what you've gone through. I'll make sure that Officer Grant receives proper training and that something like this doesn't happen again." Elijah nodded, though the apology didn't feel like enough. "Thank you, ma'am. But this isn't just about me. This is about the system that allows these assumptions to happen in the first place. It's about all the people who have to live with this kind of treatment every day." The sergeant's face softened in understanding, and for a moment, Elijah saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She nodded solemnly. "You're right. I understand that this goes deeper than a single incident." But as she spoke, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this apology, this moment, was temporary. The truth was that no amount of words could undo the damage done. He had been humiliated, questioned, and made to feel small, and that feeling wasn't something that could be easily erased. Even if Officer Grant were disciplined, even if the sergeant offered her words of support, it didn't change the fact that Elijah had just been treated as a criminal based on nothing more than his skin color and the car he drove. As the sergeant walked back to her patrol car, leaving Elijah standing there with Officer Grant, he couldn't help but wonder, would there be true accountability? Or would this just be another blip in a system that seemed designed to perpetuate these injustices? And would he, and others like him, continue to be subject to these types of interactions until something truly changed? With one final glance at Officer Grant, who now seemed lost in thought, Elijah slowly climbed back into his car. The engine purred to life, but the weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on him. His drive home, once filled with anticipation, now felt hollow. He had finally made it back to the life he had fought so hard for. But even here, in the supposed safety of his own country, he was reminded that his identity would always be under suspicion. He was a man who had served his country, a decorated officer, a loving father and husband. But to some, none of that mattered. As Elijah drove away, the flashing lights of the patrol car in his rearview mirror slowly faded into the distance. But the impact of that moment, of being reduced to nothing more than a suspect, stayed with him. And he couldn't help but wonder how many others had been through the same thing. How many others had been treated like criminals simply because of their appearance. That question lingered in the air, unanswered. The unseen wounds. As Captain Elijah Daniels drove away from the scene, his mind was still racing. The flashing lights, the harsh treatment, and the cold suspicion that had gripped the entire encounter, all of it replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't escape. He'd been through countless challenges in his life. Rigorous military training, deployments, the death of close comrades, and long separations from his family. But this moment, this unjust experience on the side of the road, felt different. It felt personal in a way that no military mission, no overseas conflict ever had. As he navigated the quiet suburban streets, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in deeper. He thought about his wife, Maya, who had been waiting for him at home. She had been counting down the days until his return, just as he had. And now, as much as he longed to hold her and tell her about the adventures and challenges he had faced, there was something far more troubling occupying his thoughts. The more Elijah thought about the incident, the more he realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about the larger narrative, the broader reality that so many black men and women had to live with every single day. He had been humiliated, stopped for no reason other than the color of his skin, and the fact that he was driving a car late at night. He had been questioned, detained, and treated with suspicion, even though his military service should have demanded respect. But the officer had seen none of that. She had seen him as a threat, as a potential criminal, and that perception was enough to shape the entire course of the evening. The deeper he delved into his thoughts, the more his frustration began to mount. He thought about the countless stories he had heard from friends and colleagues. Black men who had been stopped on the streets simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or for having the wrong skin color. He thought about the deep scars that these experiences left on people, the toll they took on one's sense of dignity and self-worth. Elijah had always known that racial bias was an issue in law enforcement, but until that night, he had never truly felt the sting of it in such a visceral way. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every turn, every street lamp casting shadows that seemed to echo his thoughts. It wasn't just a matter of being mistaken for someone else. It was about being judged on the basis of assumptions that had nothing to do with who he was or what he had accomplished in his life. It was about being made to feel small, to feel less than. The frustration continued to bubble inside him. And yet he kept his composure. What good would it do to shout, to fight back in that moment? The system wasn't built to listen to someone like him. And in that moment, he realized that sometimes the greatest fight was the one you fought inside yourself. As Elijah pulled into his driveway, the soft glow of his porch light beckoned him. The familiar sight of his home should have brought him comfort, but the memories of what had just transpired still clung to him like a weight. He cut the engine, sat in silence for a few moments, and then opened the door. He was home. But was he really? Maya had been waiting inside, as he knew she would be. The moment the door opened, she rushed toward him, her face lighting up with joy. But as her eyes met his, she saw the tiredness in his expression, the look of someone who had fought a battle that couldn't be seen, a battle that no one else could understand. "What's wrong?" Maya asked, her voice laced with concern. She reached out to him, her hands gentle, as if trying to make sense of the unease that had settled in his body. Elijah stood there for a moment, taking in her warmth, the way her presence seemed to ground him. He had longed for this moment, to finally be with her, to be home. But now, he didn't know how to explain the storm inside him. "I was stopped," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya frowned, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Stopped? By who?" "A police officer," Elijah continued, his voice growing steadier as he explained. He told her everything, the flashing lights, the questioning, the way Officer Grant had assumed the worst based on nothing but a vague description, the way he had been treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. Maya listened in silence, her face gradually morphing into a grimace of disbelief. When he finished, she took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I can't believe that happened," she said softly. "After everything you've done, after everything you've given, for them to treat you like that." Elijah didn't have the words to explain the depth of what he was feeling. He had been humiliated, but more than that, he felt invisible. The uniform he wore, the rank he held, the family he loved, it all seemed to vanish the moment the officer saw him as a threat, as a suspect. In that moment, he realized that no amount of service to his country would change the fact that, to some, he would always be a black man first. The conversation with Maya lasted long into the night. They spoke of Elijah's frustration, the pain of having his identity stripped away, and the unsettling realization that what happened to him wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of systemic injustice. As they sat together, Elijah's mind drifted back to that moment on the side of the road. He thought about Officer Grant, the young woman who had stopped him. He wondered what had led her to make such assumptions. Was it fear? Was it ignorance? Or was it simply that she hadn't been taught to see past the surface, to see the person standing before her, the man who had served in the Navy for over 2 decades, the man who had a wife and children at home waiting for him? He thought about how easily his life could have been turned upside down. How many times had people like him been wrongfully accused, or worse, had their lives taken away in moments like this? Elijah wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't simply accept that this was how things were. He couldn't accept that his identity would always be something that others would judge him by before they ever took the time to know who he really was. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Elijah said, his voice resolute. "I'll speak out. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure people know this kind of injustice isn't just a bad experience. It's a reality for so many. I can't sit back and let it happen again." Maya nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "We can't let it go, Elijah. You've been through too much to just let it slide. This needs to change." For the first time that night, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. The weight of the injustice still lingered, but he knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. Maya was with him, and together they would raise their voices, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been wronged in the same way. As Elijah went to bed that night, he couldn't stop thinking about the road ahead. He knew that the battle for justice wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be solved with one apology or one act of accountability. But he also knew that change wouldn't come if no one spoke out, if no one dared to challenge the system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. He closed his eyes, the weight of the day's events still pressing on him, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The journey wasn't over, and he would fight, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of racial injustice. The ripple effect. The next morning, Elijah woke up early, the light of dawn filtering softly through the curtains. The events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind, but there was something else now, a new sense of determination that had emerged from the emotional chaos he had experienced. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the wider issue of racial profiling, of systemic injustice that far too many people had been subjected to, and how it continued to perpetuate fear and division in communities. His story, though painful, could spark something bigger. He could make a difference, but only if he was willing to speak out and share his truth. Maya had already left for work, but Elijah could feel her support wrapping around him like a protective shield. The night before, they had talked long into the night about what the next steps might look like. Maya, who had always been his rock, had reminded him that this wasn't just about one bad experience. This was about the broader need for change. It was about standing up, even when the odds felt insurmountable. Elijah walked to the kitchen, the familiar hum of the coffee machine filling the room. As the coffee brewed, he sat at the kitchen table, his mind once again turning over the events of the previous night. The image of Officer Grant's face, clouded with suspicion, played over and over in his mind. The way she had treated him, no recognition of his rank, no acknowledgement of his service, had made him feel less than human, as though his entire identity had been reduced to a mere stereotype. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an assault on his very personhood. He sipped his coffee slowly, his thoughts drifting to the larger picture. The systems in place, both in law enforcement and in society, were designed to protect those who held power. But those same systems often targeted people who looked like him. Elijah had seen it countless times throughout his life, seen the way his blackness had been used against him, seen the way it had been weaponized by assumptions and biases. He had been a victim of it. But now, more than ever, he realized he couldn't afford to be silent. When he finally decided to speak out, he knew that it wouldn't be an easy road. The ramifications of sharing his story could be wide-reaching. He could face backlash. He could become a target of criticism, and even disdain. But he also knew this: if he remained silent, nothing would change. The truth would remain buried, and the cycle of injustice would continue. Elijah spent the morning drafting a statement, carefully choosing his words. He knew that every word mattered. It wasn't just about recounting his personal experience. It was about shining a light on the larger issue of racial profiling. He needed to make people understand that this wasn't just a one-off incident. This was part of a pattern of behavior that had deep, harmful consequences for Black men and women across the country. As he typed, memories of his time in the Navy flooded his thoughts. He had always prided himself on discipline and control, on maintaining an unwavering commitment to his mission. But what he had experienced the night before, being stopped for no reason other than his skin color, was a violation that cut deeper than any enemy he had ever faced. It was a violation of his dignity, his humanity. The weight of the words on the page was heavy, but with each sentence, he felt a sense of relief. By putting his story out there, he was taking back some of the power that had been stripped from him. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was an agent of change, and his voice could be the catalyst for something bigger. When he finally finished the statement, Elijah read it over several times, making sure his message was clear. His words were firm but respectful. He wasn't seeking revenge or animosity. He was seeking understanding and accountability. Last night, I was stopped by a police officer while I was simply trying to get home after a long deployment. I was treated with suspicion and detained without cause, despite my service as a Navy captain. The officer who stopped me did not ask for my ID until after I was detained, and even then, I was questioned like a common criminal. My identity as a Black man was the only thing that seemed to matter. This kind of treatment isn't just an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger issue. Racial profiling is real, and it is something that many of us face every day. I refuse to stay silent any longer. We must hold each other accountable and ensure that no one else has to experience what I did. It's time for change. With the press of a button, Elijah posted his statement to social media. He felt a mixture of vulnerability and strength. He had no idea how his words would be received, but he knew that he could no longer hide from the truth. His story needed to be heard. Over the next few hours, Elijah's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages poured in from friends, family, colleagues, and even complete strangers. Some were supportive, expressing their outrage at what had happened to him. Others, however, were less kind. There were those who accused him of playing the race card, of stirring up division for personal gain. The backlash wasn't surprising. He had expected it. But the supportive messages, the outpouring of understanding and solidarity, gave him strength. The most powerful messages came from other Black men and women who had experienced similar incidents. One message from a former Navy officer struck Elijah particularly hard. The man had written, "I've been through the same thing, brother, but we have to keep fighting. We can't let them silence us. Your story is our story." Elijah spent the rest of the afternoon responding to messages, speaking with reporters, and reflecting on the weight of his decision. He was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to make sense of how the system had failed him. But as he looked at the responses, he felt a sense of purpose rise within him. His story was part of a much larger movement. He wasn't alone in this fight, and neither were all the others who had suffered in silence for far too long. That evening, Elijah met with his family for dinner, his children excited to have him home. But even in the midst of their joy, Elijah couldn't escape the undercurrent of tension that lingered in his mind. He hadn't expected things to move so quickly. Within hours of posting his statement, a local news outlet had picked up the story. By the time he sat down for dinner, His phone was buzzing with calls from journalists and local politicians. "Dad, are you going to be on TV?" his son asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Elijah smiled gently, trying to keep things light. "Maybe. We'll see." But even as he answered his son, the weight of the situation loomed large. This wasn't just about the media attention. It was about something far bigger. It was about making sure that his story, and the stories of so many others like him, didn't get lost in the noise. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing the backlash and the discomfort that came with it. That night, Elijah lay awake in bed, his thoughts swirling. He thought about his family, about the life he had worked so hard to build. He thought about his Navy brothers and sisters, about the men and women who had fought alongside him, knowing that their sacrifice was often unrecognized, unnoticed. And he thought about Officer Grant, the young woman who had made assumptions based on nothing but his skin color. Elijah didn't know her story, but he knew that her actions were a reflection of a much larger issue, an issue that had been deeply ingrained in society for far too long. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. He had taken the first step. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he was no longer afraid to speak his truth. Elijah Daniels, Navy captain, husband, father, he was ready to fight for justice, for accountability, and for a future where no one would have to endure what he had. The awakening. The days that followed Elijah's decision to speak out unfolded faster than he had anticipated. His statement, initially just a personal message to friends and family, had gone viral. The press coverage escalated quickly, drawing national attention to the story of a Navy captain wrongfully detained by the police, a tale that echoed with thousands of similar experiences across the country. What Elijah had hoped would be a quiet expression of frustration had now become a focal point in a much larger conversation about racial profiling, police accountability, and the ongoing struggle for justice in America. It was late morning when Elijah received a call from a producer at one of the most prominent national news networks. They had seen his story, and they wanted to interview him on live television. The request was both an honor and a heavy responsibility. For a moment, Elijah hesitated. He had already shared his story on social media and with local outlets, but a live television interview would put him under even more scrutiny. His words would be dissected and analyzed in real time, and with so much at stake, there was no room for misstep. Maya had been with him through it all, supporting his decision to speak out, even when it meant exposing himself to public judgment. They had discussed the interview the night before, and she reminded him that this was a rare opportunity to speak on behalf of others who had faced similar injustice but had remained silent. "You're doing the right thing, Elijah," she had said, her voice steady, even though Elijah could sense the quiet fear that lingered behind her words. "Don't let fear stop you. Speak for all of them. Speak for all of us." And so, he agreed. The morning of the interview, Elijah dressed carefully. His uniform was pressed, his shoes polished to a high shine. The familiar ritual of preparing for a formal occasion, something he had done countless times as a Navy officer, felt oddly comforting. He wasn't just preparing for an interview, he was preparing to fight for change. This moment, although born out of pain, was a chance to use his voice for a purpose greater than himself. As he drove to the studio, Elijah's thoughts wandered back to the incident on the side of the road. The flashing lights, the officer's suspicion, the feeling of helplessness as he was detained like a criminal. It still hurt. The wound had not healed, and it likely never would. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this pain could fuel something positive. If he could shed light on what had happened to him, perhaps others would see it for what it truly was, not just a moment of personal suffering, but part of a much larger issue of racial injustice. The studio was bustling when Elijah arrived, reporters and crew members moving in and out of the rooms, preparing for the day's broadcasts. He was ushered into a small green room where he would wait until it was time for his segment. As he sat there, the weight of everything started to settle on him. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but now, as he waited for the interview to begin, the nerves kicked in. This wasn't just about him anymore. His story had become a rallying cry for people who felt unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. The responsibility to speak out for them, to represent the countless individuals who had faced similar treatment, weighed heavily on his shoulders. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and the producer entered. "Captain Daniels, we're ready for you. It's time." Elijah nodded, standing up and adjusting his jacket. As they walked to the studio, he could feel his heart beating faster. The familiar feelings of nervousness before a big event were starting to creep in, but this time, they felt different. This time, it wasn't just a professional engagement. This time, he was speaking out for justice. The lights in the studio were blinding when Elijah entered. Cameras were pointed at him from every angle, their red lights flashing like silent sentinels. The anchor, a woman in her 40s with a poised and serious demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Captain Daniels, thank you for being here today," the anchor said. "Your story has captured the nation's attention. This is the first time many people have heard about an experience like yours, but I know it's one that is all too familiar for many." Elijah nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thank you for having me." The anchor's tone shifted as she began to ask him about the incident. "You were stopped by a police officer under suspicion of theft, despite being a decorated Navy officer. How did that feel when you were first detained?" Elijah took a deep breath before speaking. It felt like a punch to the gut. I had just spent months at sea, working tirelessly with my team to ensure the safety of this country, and here I was, treated like a criminal. I wasn't given a chance to explain who I was. The officer didn't ask for my ID until after she had already detained me. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was the result of assumptions made based on my appearance. The anchor nodded solemnly. "That sounds incredibly frustrating, Captain. Many of our viewers have likely never experienced anything like that. What do you think needs to change to prevent situations like this from happening in the future?" Elijah's voice grew firmer as he spoke. "We need accountability. Racial profiling isn't just something that happens in isolated incidents. It's a systemic issue. Officers need better training, they need to be held accountable for their actions, and the public needs to be educated about these realities. I know that not all officers are like this, but the ones who are, who let their biases cloud their judgment, need to be held responsible." The interview continued, and Elijah found his voice growing stronger with each passing question. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever been wrongfully profiled, for every black man and woman who had been subjected to the unfair scrutiny of the justice system. His words carried weight, and he was determined to make sure they resonated. As the interview concluded, the anchor turned to the camera. "Captain Daniels, thank you for sharing your story with us today. Your bravery in speaking out is inspiring. We hope your experience serves as a reminder of the work that still needs to be done in the fight for justice." Elijah nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The interview was over, but the real work was just beginning. He had used his platform to speak out, but now he needed to keep the momentum going. His words had reached millions, but for true change to happen, there had to be action. Back at home, as Elijah reflected on the interview, he realized that his path forward wasn't just about raising awareness, it was about pushing for concrete change. The media attention would fade eventually, but the issues that had fueled his decision to speak out would remain. He was now at the forefront of a conversation about police accountability and racial justice, and he wasn't going to let it die down. That evening, Elijah took some time to reflect. He knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't fully predict. But he also knew that, no matter how hard the road ahead might be, he had taken a stand for what was right. And for that, he felt a sense of peace. Maya sat down next to him on the couch later that night, her face soft, but filled with pride. "You did good today," she said. "You spoke for all of us." Elijah smiled, taking her hand. "I spoke for all of us, but it's just the beginning. "We can't stop now." Maya squeezed his hand. "We won't stop." The days that followed were filled with meetings, interviews, and discussions with advocacy groups. Elijah became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. His voice became a beacon for change, a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice. As the public conversation continued to grow, Elijah knew that there was still so much work to be done. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. His mission wasn't over. It had just begun.